Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our Power Session webinar for today. The topic is natural gas decarbonization strategies and impacts. We're going to turn now to some housekeeping items and give people a few minutes to join us. So today's topic is going to cover initially Australia's CO2 targets as they are a key driver for why anyone would want to decarbonize the gas sector. Then we're going to spend time on the different main key gas sector decarbonization pathways that we worked on recently. We'll then turn to international best practice in gas sector decarbonization, including gas system decommissioning. And then finally, we'll focus on the techniques that we've developed and applied that we think are of interest to the wider community that cover how to best optimize gas sector decarbonization. And we'll finish with key takeaways and recommendations, and then a question and answer session. Please don't forget to vote for your preferred topic in the future. There'll be a list at the end, and there'll also be a poll that you can fill out at any time, and I encourage you to do it. This webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all registrants along with the presentation. You can also access the information online. Please do forward it on to anyone you think might be interested. And please add your questions to the chat along the way. My colleague Sarah is going to be monitoring and queuing them for the Q&A session. So thank you very much. Let's get started. Now we have a much longer CO2 decarbonization webinar, and I encourage you to check it out. These two slides have been drawn from there, and really the point of them is to set the stage to highlight that Australia is committed to the Paris Agreement and is aiming to be decarbonized by 2050. Now, some of the states, which you'll see in the next slide, have made, whoops, actually, no, it's not in the next slide, my apologies. Some of the states which are shown here actually are aiming to decarbonize as early as 2045. The other thing to note is that there is not necessarily agreement on what it's going to take to decarbonize. And for example, the Climate Change Authority and the Climate Targets Panel have come up with different targets. So either way, the country's heading to zero carbon, and some states are doing it more quickly. So in order to achieve that, what needs to be done? Here we have a breakdown by sector in terms of what needs to be done. Now, electricity generation is largely in hand, although it's not 100% decarbonized. We're seeing a lot more effort and focus on decarbonizing the electricity generation sector. The bottom graphic is perhaps more interesting for today's topic. You can see the items in orange being those sectors that have significant shares of natural gas in them. And clearly getting to zero carbon means somehow decarbonizing the natural gas system and or end uses. So that's what we're going to be focused on today. Now, if you look at this slide here, this is the projection across a number of different jurisdictions of what business as usual looks like without any additional interventions. Most of the decline is expected in electricity, gas, and water, and that's largely because of existing policies and programs like the Renewable Energy Target. Okay, now let's turn to key gas sector decarbonization pathways. Now, there are infinite pathways. We've selected the three main ones, being either changing the nature of the fuel, including decarbonizing natural gas itself through renewable natural gas or even CCS and other techniques, to thermal energy networks, which can't replace all natural gas use, but can certainly replace the amount that is used for heating and heating air and water. And then electrification, which can, I believe, with the exception of feedstocks, and even feedstocks, you can, with enough electricity, you can create from primary chemicals. Electrification can decarbonize most natural gas sector end uses. The question is at what cost and what impacts. So here's a summary. I won't go into the detail here of what I just said, which is either RNG or hydrogen, basically a clean fuels pathway. I didn't include CCS in this, but that's another alternative. You've got the thermal energy networks, which are relying on existing natural gas right-of-ways or new right-of-ways, but basically draw from a number of different sources of heat and cooling, actually, in hotter climates. You've got the electrification pathway and the hybrid approach. And what we're seeing at the moment is, because it is not clear-cut and because it varies by jurisdiction, there is a lot of interest in looking across all the different pathways and not jumping to any specific conclusions. And this is some of the work that we've been doing to actually compare those different pathways. And it's not easy, because you have to actually be able to analyze both the electricity sector and the gas sector. And with the electricity sector, there's also the transport sector. So a lot of analysis to do to provide an evidence base upon which to make sound decisions. So a lot of information on here. I mean, one of the purposes of these webinars is to bring together in the public domain information to hopefully allow the community to leverage what we've already done, take it forward, and hopefully develop their own and put it back in the public domain. On the left-hand side, you can see the Australian Hydrogen Centre's roadmap for Australia that sees the hydrogen reach 10% by the 2030s, and then ramp up to 100% on a section-by-section basis from 2035. In order to do that, of course, we're going to have to overcome some challenges, mainly around the fitness of the current system for hydrogen, if this is the pathway forward. And so we've listed across a number of limitation areas, again, thanks to the Australian Hydrogen Centre's work in this space. And some of the things that surprised me, particularly when we're modeling this stuff, is that the capacity itself shrinks, that we can get up to maybe even 100% with actually maybe less additional investment than was previously understood. But the final takeaway, which is in the bottom right side, is that the assumption around this little thing called the design factor, which is related to environmental and situational risk. It's really a risk assessment and sort of how much risk you want to put on the analysis, that your cost impact in terms of your CapEx and OpEx can be 480% of current costs at 5%, or it can be less than 1%. So clearly that design factor is something that needs to be very treated very carefully and cautiously. When you get up to even 10%, the 0.6 design factor moves up to 68%. And this is something that we found in our work, that aside from the cost of hydrogen getting into the pipeline, it does lead to, or at least the analysis here suggests, that it leads to a significantly higher CapEx and OpEx, at least for the existing natural gas system. A final question is just how competitive hydrogen and RNG and other clean fuels might be. Here's some work that's now a little bit older, but you have some great visuals there in terms of current costs for natural gas and diesel, and then RNG, renewable diesel, et cetera. And on the bottom left and bottom right, we sort of line them up and compare, where is diesel at the moment, and where do we expect it, where is it expected to go into the future, and how does that compare to some of the zero carbon alternatives. Now in diesel, you've already got a number of pretty good options, and it looks like biodiesel is expected to even be lower cost in the future. Hydrogen's a different story, as is RNG, and you see it never really getting anywhere close to natural gas on its own. So this is the cost, the production cost. This has to then get added to the distribution and pipeline system, given those previous cost increases. With respect to hydrogen, with respect to renewable natural gas, more than hydrogen, hydrogen has an unlimited supply because you can make it from renewable energy. I mean, you can make it other ways, but renewable energy, which is zero carbon, is pretty plentiful. With RNG and other biofuels, they have to come from feedstock. Now, work's been done by ARENA showcasing where it could be drawn from, but ultimately it still only amounts to about 20% of current energy supply. And it's not clear if that's on an annual basis and for how long. But what is really lacking, at least in the work I've seen, is an analysis of the supply cost curve so that we can better align the availability with the level of demand over time. And I think that's really needed to figure out where and when and which biofuels are likely to be cost effective and how they can help the country transition, particularly in the short term. Right, let's turn to thermal energy networks. Here there's a diagram on the top left about how these networks work. I mean, in Europe, they have a lot more of these, and they have a lot higher heat loads as well in suburban areas. The North America is starting to look at this with greater interest, partly because of the need to decarbonize. And so we show you some of the potential sources of energy. Mostly it's done via the geothermal network, which is a specific pipeline that's built for this purpose and draws from the thermal energy in the earth. Some of the pilots you see on the right, you can see that they're testing space heating and space cooling mainly, and they're testing it across residential, commercial, and building campuses, et cetera. So moving forward, and I just saw in the chat, I looked over quickly, and there's questions about whether we'll touch on decommissioning, and yes, we will, because regardless of some of these alternatives, generally it leads to a situation where you're going to have to think about what you do with your gas network. All right. Final thing to talk about in thermal energy networks is looking at, one of the key questions. We all know what a geothermal heat pump costs, ground source heat pump costs when you install it in a house. What's less well understood is how much it costs to operate it as a potential future utility. And here, the data is not great, but we've pulled together what we've been able to find, and we're looking to try and put it into more comparable terms, like dollar per customer, dollar per end use, and how that then compares with the current natural gas system. So electrification is the other another main alternative. We have the definition of beneficial in the top, which means that it's a win-win-win for the environment, for the energy systems, and for the consumer by being more cost effective. It's largely driven by differences in appliance operating and investment costs, and then of course the bill. And so what we have shown here on the bottom left is the price forecast, a price forecast in Australia that's relatively recent, showing retail price projections to 2050. And you can see they are comparable, they are on different axes. So the question around whether or not electrification is going to be beneficial, it will boil down to differences in the appliance cost. Now, one of the key issues of electrification is that moving all of that gas demand onto the electricity network. And you can see here that there is some potential synergy in the sense that summer electricity peak demand day doesn't correlate very well with gas consumption. So top left is the gas consumption on the gas winter peak day. Actually, it says winter electricity peak day, but I'm pretty sure that's winter gas peak day. And the bottom left is the summer electricity peak day. And it's to really highlight that while the gas demand does spike in the winter, generally speaking, it's not nearly as much use on the electricity network. So there's a lot of spare capacity it could be using. Now, how that spare capacity gets eaten up over time, you can see in the bottom left in some work we've done. Under different scenarios, you can change this. I think that's a North American. No, sorry, it's been converted to Australian. Starting off in the summer or in January, and then ultimately moving to an August timeframe can be the impact of electrification, moving to a winter peak. Now, there are a lot of different techniques that can be used, which I'll describe in the next section to mitigate that. But those are some of the key key pathways and some of the associated issues. Let's talk about best practice now. So a lot of this is drawn from the California analyses, and California's gas decommissioning program is probably the most advanced in the world that we're able to find. We've seen some work in Australia, we've seen some work in the UK, but none of it goes into the depth of analysis that we see with the approach in California. And some of the key things that they have led the way on is in segmenting the gas system in terms of how you might decommission it. You can see in the top left a system that's meshed on the right and has more spurs, I guess is a word that's used, or terminal branches here. And the system on the left is a lot easier to plan because there are lots of areas that can be pruned with relatively impact cost. When you get into a mesh system, it's quite fundamentally different. You need to hydraulically model the system to make sure the gas pressures remain at the right levels in a similar sort of analytical approach as electricity load flow. And if you don't have all of the necessary data, you really can't say much. And so it's really left up to the gas utilities to do that investigation. They also came up with a number of different targeting criteria. You can see in the bottom left, things like, hey, maybe we should target assets that will need a lot of capex. Also, we should target areas that have relatively low consumption, because those areas on a dollar per unit basis are relatively high cost. And of course, there's an equity or fairness lens that gets applied as well. They then turn to develop and describe a series of pilots to test their hypotheses. And you can see here, bottom right, that they've looked at specific portions of the network. And this was with the, I believe this is with the support of the community, to test out their various decommissioning approaches and also their associated costs. The other element, so that's great, and looks at the gas sector and the gas industry. The gas consumers are another key element of success of gas decommissioning. At some point, if the gas system is decommissioned, folks will no longer be able to use their gas appliances. And so a lot of the focus on in the US is on removing barriers to decommissioning. And so here's some work we were involved in, speaking to all of the building electrification, or not all of them, 9 of them in California, about what they saw as the biggest barriers. And you can see what stands out here is the high upfront cost to consumers. And then we line up the different solutions on the right. So financial incentives, education, et cetera, and a systematic way to remove these barriers. Now, in the US, it's a little bit complicated in terms of the overlapping jurisdictions and where you can draw money from. And so here we looked at different end uses, in this case, space heating, water heating, cooking, by low income, medium income, and high income. And we sought to net off other programs to reveal what was left in terms of an upfront cost differential, and then design programs to address that. Bottom left is comparing the industry, the market average, with what different distributions of costs are, because not all the costs are the same. And it's really tricky to get that right. You can give it on average, but you're either going to overpay or underpay if you're not careful. The other thing that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is rate reform in California, which sought to put more cost onto the fixed portion to bring down the variable portion. Now, it's a little bit hard to see here because we've used a small format, but the new BE rate, or building electrification rates, are cheaper than the existing time of use rates, and a lot cheaper than the inclining block rates. So that's one of the approaches they've used. Now, the other thing to consider is the decommissioning cost allocation. And globally, they've come up with, well, this is actually from the UK, 5 different methods, whether the government pays it off, the taxpayers, the gas network investors, future consumers, current consumers, or potentially people who purchase the networks for repurposing, like TENS. All right, so we took all that on board in some of the work we've done recently in actually identifying optimized decommissioning pathways. Now, one of the first things we want to raise is data and access to data and data availability, because it's not just that the data exists and it's only available to the gas utilities, who sometimes we have worked for. It's also that the gas information may not yet exist because it hasn't been important to date. So policymakers and those involved in planning the gas system need to, I think, consider what information is going to be needed and try and ensure that that information is readily available for the purpose. Otherwise, you'll have to plan on a more coarse-grained level. So based on the targeting optimization criteria we developed based on best practice research and knocking out the hydraulic feasibility, which is pretty high up there, we focused on the costs and benefits, which also involved usage criteria, because if you have to recover 100 units and you've got 100 people, you need 100 units 100 units, 100 people, you need 1 unit per person per year. But if you need to recover 100 units and you've only got 50 people, they have to get recovered twice as much. And so that sort of analysis factored into our estimate of when gas usage would fall. We actually used price elasticity of demand estimated from historical customer consumption relative to price. And so we're showing you some of the types of results you might get here when you're considering differences in scenarios between delayed, maybe balanced, and accelerated decommissioning approaches. And when you're considering your decommissioning approach, some of the key things to test are the start year and the duration, which gives you an end year. And then the other thing to test is whether or not you want to do it on a phase basis, i.e. an equal amount over time, which you can see on the right side, or if you want to do it via a threshold basis. Basically, once a section of the network becomes uneconomic or is likely to get hit into a death spiral, as it's often called, then that would trigger its decommissioning. And I think one of the key observations is that the threshold-based shutdown happens quite quickly. And so once that threshold's reached, prices rise quite quick, can rise quite quickly depending on cost allocation, but assuming it's applied to those that are using it. And that can lead to a very short window, which might have deliverability questions. So the other key question then is, how do you actually allocate costs? And those costs are mainly in the decommissioning itself, but also in asset write-downs to the extent they exist. And when you decommission sooner, you'll have a larger asset base or regulated asset base than if you do it later. We have some examples from research in terms of different decommissioning costs that we've been able to identify online. And then we fed them into our decommissioning models. And we trialed 3 different approaches. One is accelerated cost recovery, which basically allocated more of the cost to current consumers, taxpayer funded, allocating it to taxpayers. And then the final was recovery as incurred. Then this basically mostly allocated to the remaining ones. And you can see here that the taxpayer funded obviously doesn't put that feedback loop into the price. Prices are lower until the actual gas is decommissioned. Accelerated, as you would expect, tends to increase prices early on, but they're lower over time. And then as recovered, tends to be lower initially, but rises up quickly. Now, in the comparison of which is the best option, it really depends on the costs in the sector in question, appliance turnover rates, decommissioning costs, and so forth. So this is a key question, but it's important that the actual cost allocation is factored into consumer price elasticity of demand and ultimately the timing approach taken for decommissioning itself. So one other thing I'd say, and then we're close to time, so we'll end there and take questions. But things to think about in the electricity sector, we talked about the change in peak demand. Here's another view based on the analysis we did for clean fuels electrification and thermal energy networks. You can see some of them lead to the winter peak sooner than others. Sometimes they also bounce back because of the interplay between electrified load and another load. One of the most interesting things, though, we discovered is when you change the timing of peak demand, it also changes the correlation with transport electrification, or it can do. And so that's what we saw here, that there was a very low level of correlation until you have the change in the timing, and then it jumped up, made transport electrification that much more significant. So this cross-sector analysis is really important to get right. Otherwise, things can happen without really being aware of them, so these unintended consequences. Now, the good news in the electricity sector is there is a heap of different mitigation solutions for managing any peak demand, managing most peak demand caused by electrification. Things like more efficient appliances, flexible appliances, and of course behind the meter storage, and even distributed behind the meter resources. And we've seen by employing these on a scenario basis that this can claw back in the case of one state in one state in Australia. It can claw back a lot of the otherwise negative, higher cost outcomes. Right, key takeaways and recommendations. So there's a list here, but fundamentally, gas is a significant contributor to emissions and we need to decarbonize it. Electrification is one option, a significant option, but there are others and they should be investigated. Electrification can cover full decarbonization, but it has cost implications and these need to be mitigated to keep costs lower. Data availability is a key issue in the gas decommissioning analyses, and more work is needed there to make sure the information is available. And when looking at optimizing gas decommissioning, if that ultimately needs to occur, is the timing, duration, and segmentation of the system, and as well as any policy sort of levers around bans for new premises, end of life, incentives, and then the cost allocation question. And some of the work that we've done suggests that there is significant costs involved in bringing forward gas system decommissioning. And this needs to be well understood, and that by giving more time for folks to transition their appliances away from gas and also to allow the asset base to reduce over time can help reduce these costs while still meeting whatever the ultimate time frame is. So I've got some recommendations there. Take a wide view of the pathways, investigate the costs across all of the different options, obtain better data, and when optimizing the decarbonization pathway, take a whole of system approach, including customer appliance costs, but also other sectors. And cost allocation needs to be thought through because it does impact on what consumers are exposed to, but also how they respond and what that means for other consumers who may be vulnerable. So thank you very much. I hope you got something out of that, and I look forward to the questions. So we'll look forward to the poll as well, but let's start with the questions. Sarah, if you don't mind teeing these up. We've done a lot of modeling around energy efficiency, and in some cases it's a win-win-win. Air source heat pump is a win-win-win, for example. You do have to be mindful of potential resistive solutions in there that can lead to higher peak demand costs, but it's not always the case. Right now, we can't really make air source heat pumps work for water heating, and resistive looks a lot more useful. I think it's not just if we use less energy, by the way, but we use less expensive energy, and using more energy in the the height of summer during the maximum solar PV export time is probably actually a net benefit. So that's where potentially resistive technology might play a role. Thank you. So is the design factor analysis only applicable to new pipelines? How does design factor specifically influence OpEx? So I am not a huge expert on design factors. My understanding, based on the research we've done to date, is that it applies not only to new but also existing pipelines. And in terms of influencing OpEx, I have not seen how it directly influences OpEx, but generally in industry, there's a rule we apply, which is that OpEx is around 2.5% of CapEx. So if something's more expensive, it's going to be more expensive to maintain. That's a general rule. Is there any research into the potential cost premium for appliances that are 100% hydrogen ready? And would there be impacts on appliance replacement costs for other sustainable fuels? So I think there has been a lot of work on 100% hydrogen ready appliances, and they are higher cost. I can't point to specific studies at this time, but one of the benefits of using renewable natural gas is it doesn't require any changes to end-use appliances. Thank you. What regulatory roadblocks prevent them from decommissioning their networks? Is this analysis useful but not actionable? I mean, this is at core a political question, and if you don't have the support of the community, it won't get done. If you do have the support of the community, then there are other sources of resistance like impacts on vulnerable customers, or inequitable transfers between different kinds of energy consumers, electricity consumers, and gas consumers, because to the extent that this new load coming on from the gas sector is lower cost to serve and paying a higher price, that should tend to reduce per unit prices for electricity consumers. And is that fair? So there's a lot of elements. Technically, it's not the issue, but as with most things, it's who benefits and who pays. Out of the total cost of decommissioning the network, roughly how much would be the physical cost of decommissioning versus asset write-down costs? That's a good question, and it really depends on the system. The utilities go through sort of boom busts, where generally because new connections happen in phase, there was a big electrification push, there might have been a big growth in population, and so you get these waves of renewal. And so if we're looking at this right after a wave of renewal, the asset base will be huge. And so, understanding where you are in the cycle is really important. And then the decommissioning costs, that also is a function of what the jurisdiction pursues. Do they just bury it in place? Do they cap it? Do they take it all out and fill it with pristine earth? This is a community question, so it will depend on the circumstance. Have we considered how best to take account of those users, particularly in industry, who do not have practical electrification options and currently rely on the gas network connection? So that has been a key question in the work we've done in Australia. And often the larger industrial users will be on the higher pressure system. So you still may be able to decommission the low pressure system. But there are also examples of businesses that will be on the lower pressure system and will have challenges in decommissioning. We were involved in work that is published for Infrastructure Victoria that looked at specific electrification options for virtually all industry in Victoria. And this was done by our partner, but they found that there were ready solutions in most cases. I think one of the key ones where it's harder to do is where natural gas is the feedstock. Thank you. To what extent are carbon prices necessary or sufficient to ensure coordinated gas decommissioning strategy? I would say that carbon prices can be sufficient. I don't know that sufficient carbon prices are politically achievable. I don't think they're necessary, though. I think that we've seen enough examples where either at the state level, the two examples that I'm aware of, we have state examples in Australia. We've got state examples in in the United States, and you have like UK and European examples in Europe. So I think there are different ways to do it, and the carbon price is a pretty blunt instrument. Doesn't mean it can't be done well. You mentioned 20% loss of customers as a threshold to start decommissioning. So one of the challenges in this modeling and in this area is that there are almost no examples of gas system decommissioning other than maybe single pipelines. So, whether it's 10% or 20% or 50%, those numbers can be determined based on hydraulic modeling, and they can also be determined based on economic analysis. Do you have any views on the regulatory policy barriers to different cost sharing options in an Australian context? I guess I do have views with respect to what seems fair, and there are different approaches, right? It may seem fair that those that are paying over time should incur the costs, but if those costs, if there are segments that cannot move away from the gas system, is that fair? I think in some of the work we've done, I had not one of the surprises for me personally was that when you start to factor in customer price responsiveness, that once declines reach a certain level and price increases reach a certain level just because of the need to recover costs, that the feedback loop is as fast as, well, we modeled it as fast as stock turnover, but it could be faster where people just abandon their appliances and buy new ones. So I think that's going to actually be a really important thing to manage well. I mean, aside from consumers' response to significant price increases in their gas bills, just who it's impacting, and how do we best manage that transition? Is injecting biomethane into the gas distribution? Is injecting biomethane into the gas network distribution networks remotely cost-effective or feasible, given there are only limited biomethane potential in Australia and many consumers are going to electrify anyway? So I'd like to use the term renewable natural gas because it's been processed to be the same quality as mains gas. I mean, I wasn't involved in the work that Arena did around biofuels. And so we'll take their 40% of current energy system on face value, and that's quite, or 45%, that's quite a significant amount of energy, and that half of their 40% of it is accessible, assuming that means economic as well. There could be a considerable amount of RNG that could be injected, and that could lower CO2 costs in the shorter term, while potentially allowing for those gas assets to be used a bit longer. So again, this is a very complex area. I mean, if you even take the politics out of it, economically speaking, it's very complex. And as I said, if you have an asset and you have to write it down, that's a cost. And if you can get a bit more life out of that asset, that might be the more economic thing to do. Well, here's a specific question about the ACT. I mean, the ACT is one of several jurisdictions, including Victoria, that have committed to 2040, a 2045 timeframe. So we won't speak to any specific involvement that we have, but we have worked in most jurisdictions in Australia on the natural gas question. All right, well, I think I'm getting a message here. Please don't forget to vote in the poll. If you could do that and give us some guidance as to where you'd like us to focus our efforts in the future. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. I know it's early in Sydney and crazy early in Perth, which is where I am at the moment. And we'll look forward to hopefully welcoming you to the next webinar. So thank you very much.